March 5, 1943. At Second Corps headquarters in Tunisia, Major General Lloyd Fredendall sat across from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had flown in personally to deliver a decision that would quietly end Fredendall's combat career. Fredendall was relieved of command, effective immediately. His replacement, Major General George S. Patton, Jr., would assume control the following day. Fredendall was ordered to return to Algiers, then onward to Washington. The order was verbal, precise, and unemotional. Eisenhower offered no explanation. None was needed. 2 weeks earlier, Fredendall's Second Corps had been shattered at Kasserine Pass, the worst defeat suffered by American forces in the North African campaign. Thousands of U.S. casualties, entire units broken and routed. In the aftermath, Fredendall blamed everyone but himself. His subordinates were incompetent, intelligence had failed him. The troops were inexperienced and panicked. Eisenhower's decision made clear what he thought of those excuses. Fredendall packed his belongings believing his career was finished. He had no idea how wrong he was. February 14, 1943. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel struck through Kasserine Pass in central Tunisia. His objective was straightforward: break the American line, seize supply depots, and prove that U.S. forces could not stand against seasoned German veterans. Fredendall's Second Corps was spread thin across a 70-mile front, 30,000 men scattered into isolated positions. Orders conflicted. Defensive gaps were wide enough for entire panzer divisions to drive through unopposed. When Rommel attacked, American defenses collapsed within hours. Battalions disintegrated, equipment was abandoned, soldiers fled on foot and in vehicles, panic spreading faster than the German advance. By February 22nd, German forces had pushed nearly 50 miles forward. American casualties exceeded 6,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles were destroyed or left behind. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in U.S. Army history. Fredendall was nowhere near the fighting. He had constructed his headquarters deep inside a canyon far behind the front, by most accounts 80 to 100 miles from the nearest forward positions. Engineers spent weeks blasting a command post out of solid rock, while frontline soldiers dug shallow foxholes without overhead cover. While dynamite echoed through Speedy Valley to improve Fredendall's view, German 88s tore through American armor just miles from men with nowhere to hide. One man built a fortress. His soldiers dug graves in frozen mud. Fredendall rarely visited frontline units. He issued orders by telephone to commanders he barely knew. When Eisenhower arrived on February 20th to assess the disaster, what he witnessed sealed Fredendall's fate. He didn't just need to be relieved, he needed to be removed immediately. March 6, 1943. George S. Patton arrived in Tunisia. Summoned urgently from Morocco, Patton received a blunt directive from Eisenhower: take command of Second Corps. Fix it. Fast. Patton landed wearing polished boots, ivory-handled pistols, and barely concealed rage. He toured units relentlessly. He fired officers on the spot. He enforced discipline Fredendall had ignored. He went to positions Fredendall had never seen. Within 2 weeks, Second Corps was transformed. Chaos gave way to discipline. Fear was replaced by aggression. The same soldiers who had broken at Kasserine now stood firm, repelled German attacks, and began winning engagements. Nothing had changed, except leadership. Patton wrote in his diary that Fredendall's command arrangements were the worst he had ever seen. The underground headquarters, the scattered forces, the absence of forward command. It was professional malpractice. But Fredendall was already gone. His flight from Tunisia to Washington took 3 days, stopping in Algiers and Morocco. No ceremonies, no press, just quiet removal. When his plane landed at Bowling Field on March 16th, Fredendall expected investigations, hearings, a court-martial. Instead, a military band was playing. Reporters waited with cameras. A War Department car stood ready. Fredendall stepped off the plane expecting disgrace and was greeted with celebration. To anyone who knew the truth, that music sounded less like a welcome and more like a funeral march for accountability. The official statement praised his distinguished combat service. No mention of Kasserine Pass, no acknowledgement that he had been fired mid-campaign. General Marshall now faced a dilemma of his own. Court-Martial Fredendall had admit catastrophic failure in leadership or quietly move him out of harm's way. Complicating matters, Fredendall had powerful allies in Congress. Worse still, Eisenhower had recommended him for promotion months earlier. That recommendation still sat on Marshall's desk. Marshall chose discretion over accountability. Fredendall would be promoted to lieutenant general and assigned to command 2nd Army, a stateside training organization. When Eisenhower learned of the promotion, he was stunned. The man he had fired for incompetence was being rewarded. On June 1, 1943, Lloyd Fredendall received his third star with full honors. The citation praised leadership and experience. Kasserine Pass went unmentioned. The man who caused the disaster now wore the same rank as the man who repaired it. News reached Tunisia quickly. Officers who had buried friends under Fredendall's command read the announcement with disbelief and fury. For them, it wasn't a promotion, it was an insult. Patton was outraged. He was court-martialing officers for lesser failures, while Fredendall advanced untouched. Letters poured into the War Department from Tunisia. How could the architect of the worst defeat be promoted while subordinates were punished? Marshall's response never changed: the needs of the service. The truth was simpler. Politics had won. Fredendall's connections, woven through Wyoming's political elite and tied directly to General Pershing, made him untouchable. Any public disgrace risked congressional investigations that could expose deeper institutional failures. So the system protected itself. Others paid the price. Capable officers were relieved, careers destroyed. Fredendall remained safe in Memphis. Patton never forgot the lesson. Competence mattered less than connections. Responsibility was dangerous. Blame flowed downward. Eisenhower understood this too. He remained publicly silent, choosing political survival over confrontation. From that point forward, failed commanders would be quietly reassigned, never publicly exposed. Fredendall finished the war training troops. Adequate, unremarkable. His greatest contribution became an example of how not to command. He retired in 1946 with full honors. His biography described distinguished service. Kasserine Pass became a footnote. Bradley later wrote that Fredendall commanded from a bunker far behind the lines. Patton was harsher, calling him a coward. Eisenhower called his relief unavoidable. None of it changed the outcome. Fredendall kept his stars, his pension, his reputation. The soldiers stayed buried in North Africa. We call political face-saving a necessity, but every star Fredendall wore was paid for by families receiving telegrams instead of promotions. In Washington, a career was saved. In Tunisia, a cemetery was filled. History remembers victories, but sometimes it forgets who was protected and who paid the price. Because in war, competence can be negotiated, connections cannot. The story of Lloyd Fredendall does not end at Kasserine Pass, or even with his promotion. It ends with a question the United States Army never fully answered during the war: who pays for failure? On paper, the Army learned from Kasserine. Tactics improved, training hardened. Commanders like Patton proved that American soldiers could fight and win against the best German formations when properly led. The battlefield lesson was absorbed quickly. The institutional lesson was not. Because while American forces recovered in Tunisia, the system that had allowed disaster to happen remained intact. Worse, it was reinforced. The promotion of Fredendall sent a message that echoed far beyond North Africa. It told every officer watching that accountability was optional, that responsibility could be negotiated, and that political insulation mattered more than performance under fire. That message did not vanish with the desert dust. It followed the army into Sicily, into Normandy, into the Ardennes. It shaped careers, it shaped decisions, and it shaped the behavior of men who learned, consciously or not, that survival within the institution required caution, not courage, and connections, not competence. The men who died at Kasserine never heard that message. They paid for failure in the most final way possible. They paid for scattered defenses, for absent leadership, for orders issued from deep underground. Their reward was silence. Their commander's reward was a third star. That contrast is the moral center of this story. George Marshall believed he was protecting the army. Eisenhower believed he was protecting morale. Both men told themselves that exposing the truth would do more harm than good. In the narrow sense, they were right. A public reckoning in early 1943 might have shaken confidence in a nation still learning how to fight a global war. But the cost of that decision was paid quietly, over time, by men who learned that the institution would not always defend them in return. The Army emerged from World War II victorious, but not purified. The precedent set at Kasserine lingered. Failure, when wrapped in the right politics, could be survived, sometimes even rewarded. Success, by contrast, offered no such protection. It was expected. It was expendable. This is why Fredendall's story matters beyond the specifics of North Africa. It reveals the hidden machinery of power inside a wartime institution, how reputations are preserved, how blame is redirected, how uncomfortable truths are buried beneath ceremonies and citations. It shows how a system designed to fight external enemies can become consumed with protecting itself from internal embarrassment. And it forces an uncomfortable truth. Armies are not judged only by how they win, but by how they account for failure. The U.S. Army eventually became one of the most effective fighting forces in history, but that success should not blind us to the compromises made along the way. Victory does not erase moral debt, it only delays the reckoning. Patton understood this instinctively. His fury was not just personal, it was philosophical. He believed that command was sacred, that leadership demanded presence, risk, and accountability. To Patton, Fredendall was not merely incompetent, he was a violation of an ancient contract between leader and soldier. When that contract breaks, discipline becomes hollow, courage becomes conditional, and sacrifice becomes exploitation. Eisenhower, by contrast, learned a different lesson. He learned that leadership at the highest level required political survival. He learned when to fight and when not to. That calculation made him an effective supreme commander. It also ensured that men like Fredendall would never face the full weight of their failures. Neither man was entirely wrong, and that is what makes the story unsettling. Because war is not fought by ideals alone, it is fought by institutions, and institutions prioritize continuity over justice. They absorb shock, they conceal weakness, they protect their own. Sometimes that is necessary, sometimes it is fatal. The families of Kasserine learned this the hard way. They learned that explanations are carefully worded, that blame is diffused, that accountability is selective. They learned that medals and promotions do not always reflect merit, and that truth, once inconvenient, can be permanently deferred. History eventually records these contradictions, but rarely corrects them. Fredendall retired comfortably. His biography was sanitized. His failures were reduced to footnotes. The men who died under his command remained statistics. That imbalance is not accidental, it is structural. And it raises a final question that outlives the war itself. Can an institution that protects failure truly honor sacrifice? The answer in 1943 was no. The army moved on. The war was won, but the lesson remained buried beneath paperwork and precedent. In protecting its image, the institution taught future leaders that image mattered more than truth. That lesson did not vanish in Tunisia. It resurfaced whenever politics intersected with command, whenever accountability threatened reputation, whenever failure could be rebranded as experience. Kasserine Pass was not just a defeat of arms, it was a warning, one that was acknowledged tactically and ignored morally. And so the story ends not with Fredendall, not with Patton, not with Eisenhower, but with the soldiers whose names are carved in stone far from Washington. They never knew the political calculations made on their behalf. They never heard the justifications. They only knew the consequences. They followed orders. They held ground that could not be held. They paid for mistakes they did not make. In the end, that is the measure of leadership. Not the stars on a uniform, not the citations, not the careers preserved, but the distance between the man giving the orders and the men who die carrying them. At Kasserine Pass, that distance was measured in miles of rock, layers of protection, and a system unwilling to confront itself. History may soften its language, official records may omit names, but the truth remains unchanged. Some failures are buried, some careers are saved, and some graves are permanent. That is the real legacy of Kasserine Pass, and the cost of choosing political comfort over moral clarity.